May 8, 1945. 1847 hours. Camp Concordia, Kansas. Oberstfreiter Heinrich Müller stood motionless before a dining table laden with food he had only seen in American propaganda films. A thick beef hamburger with melted cheese. Golden French fries still steaming. A bottle of ice-cold Coca-Cola beating with condensation in the prairie heat. For 3 years, he had survived on ersatz coffee, black bread, and turnip soup. For the last 6 months as a prisoner, he had expected abuse, perhaps starvation. Instead, an American sergeant had just placed before him more food than his family in Hamburg had seen in a year. Muller's hands trembled as he reached for the hamburger. He took one bite, and tears began streaming down his face. Within minutes, he was sobbing uncontrollably. The American guards exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to intervene. This scene would repeat itself thousands of times across hundreds of POW camps scattered throughout the American heartland, from the wheat fields of Kansas to the cotton plantations of Mississippi. What the U.S. military had discovered, quite by accident, was that kindness could break a man faster than any interrogation technique. A hamburger and a Coca-Cola had become the most devastating psychological weapons of the war. The transformation of German prisoners of war began not in interrogation rooms, but in mess halls across America. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had established clear requirements for prisoner treatment, but the United States went far beyond minimum standards, creating a situation that would fundamentally alter the psychological state of hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers. The first large groups of German POWs arrived on American soil in 1943, following the North African Campaign. According to War Department records, by May 1945, the United States held approximately 371,683 German prisoners in 511 camps spread across 45 states. These men had been told by Nazi propaganda that capture by Americans meant torture and death. Many had been specifically instructed to commit suicide rather than surrender. Lieutenant Joseph Hartmann, captured at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia on February 20, 1943, later testified to Army historians about his expectations upon arrival. We had been shown photographs, allegedly of American atrocities. We were told the Americans would work us to death in mines, that we would be starved and beaten. Some men in my unit had sewn cyanide capsules into their uniforms. Hartmann arrived at Camp Hearn, Texas, on April 3, 1943, after a 3-week journey by ship and train. What Hartmann and thousands of others encountered defied everything they had been prepared for. Army records from the Provost Marshal General's office document the standard daily ration for German POWs, established by War Department Circular 19, dated March 1943. Each prisoner received 4,000 calories per day, more than American soldiers in combat zones, and substantially more than German civilians were receiving under Allied bombing campaigns. The menu rotation, documented in camp administrative records, included items most Germans had not tasted since before the war. Monday breakfast featured eggs, bacon, toast with butter, coffee with real sugar, and orange juice. Tuesday lunch included roast beef, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, fresh bread, and apple pie. Wednesday dinner offered fried chicken, corn on the cob, biscuits, and ice cream. These were not occasional treats but standard fare, repeated week after week. Feldwebel Otto Kraus, captured at Normandy and processed through Camp Shanks, New York, before transfer to Camp Aliceville, Alabama, described his first American meal in a 1946 affidavit to the International Red Cross. I thought it was a trick. They had prepared this elaborate meal to photograph us eating, for propaganda purposes. I refused to touch the food for hours. Then I watched other prisoners eating, and no one was punished. The guards actually encouraged us to eat more. I finally took one bite of the hamburger, and I could not stop myself. I ate everything on the tray and asked for more. They gave me seconds without hesitation. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. These were men who had spent years under strict military discipline, surviving on increasingly meager rations as Germany's situation deteriorated. Many had not seen fresh meat in months. Some had been subsisting on acorn coffee and sawdust bread. The abundance they encountered in American camps created immediate cognitive dissonance that their training had not prepared them to handle. The phenomenon that American military psychiatrists would later term nutritional shock syndrome manifested in unexpected ways across the camp system. Medical officers, unprepared for the psychological response to adequate nutrition, documented cases that defied their understanding of prisoner behavior. Captain Robert Thornhill, chief medical officer at Camp Clinton, Mississippi, filed a report with the Surgeon General's office on July 15, 1944, describing what he witnessed in the first week after 1,200 German prisoners arrived from the Atlantic crossing. Approximately 40% of the incoming prisoners experienced emotional breakdowns within 72 hours of their first American meal. The trigger was not interrogation or confinement stress, but simply the presentation of food in quantities they had not seen in years. Thornhill's report detailed specific cases. Gefreiter Franz Weber, age 23, from Stuttgart, had been captured at Anzio. Upon being served a steak dinner with potatoes, vegetables, and cherry pie, Weber experienced what the medical staff initially diagnosed as a psychotic episode. He began laughing and crying simultaneously, Thornhill wrote. He clutched the steak to his chest and kept repeating, "Es ist nicht möglich, it's not possible." We had to sedate him. When he recovered, he apologized profusely and asked if his family in Germany could receive even a fraction of what he had been served. The pattern repeated itself with remarkable consistency. War Department psychological assessment teams, dispatched to investigate the phenomenon in late 1944, documented their findings in classified reports recently declassified under the Freedom of Information Act. Dr. Abraham Weinstein, a psychiatrist assigned to evaluate conditions at camps in Texas and Louisiana, noted in his December 1944 report, the prisoners are experiencing severe cognitive dissonance. They have been conditioned to believe Americans are barbaric enemies, yet they are receiving treatment superior to what German civilians are experiencing. This contradiction is causing psychological breaks that manifest as uncontrollable crying, hysterical laughter, or catatonic states. The Coca-Cola phenomenon proved particularly devastating. The soft drink, which had become ubiquitous in American military culture, represented something beyond mere refreshment to German prisoners. Underoffizier Wilhelm Becker, interviewed by Red Cross representatives at Camp Ruston, Louisiana, in March 1945, explained, "In Germany, Coca-Cola was something we saw in American films before the war. It represented everything about American excess and decadence that we were taught to despise. When they handed me an ice-cold bottle, I stared at it for several minutes. The bottle was covered in frost. Real ice. We had not had ice in Germany for years. The taste was sweet, sweeter than anything I had experienced since childhood. I drank it and immediately vomited. Not from the drink itself, but from the realization of what it meant." What Becker articulated was the central psychological crisis facing German POWs in American camps. Every meal represented evidence that everything they had been told about the enemy was false. Every hamburger was proof that German propaganda had been lies. Every bottle of Coca-Cola demonstrated that the decadent Americans possessed resources that the superior Germanic civilization could not match. Camp commanders, initially bewildered by the emotional responses, began documenting the phenomenon systematically. Colonel James Patterson, commanding officer of Camp Mexia, Texas, wrote to the Provost Marshal General on August 30, 1944, request guidance on handling prisoner emotional responses to mess hall operations. We have sufficient medical staff for physical ailments but are unprepared for the psychological impact of adequate nutrition on men who have been systematically starved and lied to by their own government. The systematic collapse of Nazi ideology in American POW camps occurred not through forced re-education, but through the simple contradiction between propaganda and reality. German prisoners had been indoctrinated for years with specific narratives about American society, and every meal in captivity demolished those narratives brick by brick. Dr. Paul Friedrich, a Wehrmacht medical officer captured at Remagen Bridge in March 1945, provided extensive testimony to U.S. Army historians in 1946 about the ideological preparation German soldiers received. We were taught that America was a mongrel nation, weakened by racial mixing and Jewish influence. We were told Americans were soft, that they could not endure hardship, that their society was collapsing under the weight of its own decadence. We were assured that German discipline and Aryan superiority would inevitably triumph over American material excess. Friedrich arrived at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, on April 18, 1945. His first American meal shattered every assumption he had carried into captivity. They served us hamburgers, which I had been taught were made from inferior meat scraps that only demonstrated American wastefulness. But the hamburger I received was thick, juicy, made from quality beef that I had not tasted since before the war. There were fresh vegetables, real butter, white bread made from wheat flour, not the dark bread made from mixed grains and fillers that we had in Germany. And there was ice cream for dessert. Ice cream. In the middle of a war. The cognitive dissonance extended beyond food. Camp libraries, mandated by Geneva Convention compliance, contained American newspapers and magazines that prisoners could read freely. Hauptmann Ernst Kessler, a company commander captured in the Ardennes, described his experience at Camp Concordia in a 1947 interview. I spent my first week reading American newspapers, expecting to find evidence of the social collapse we had been promised. Instead, I read about war production numbers that exceeded anything Germany had achieved. I saw advertisements for consumer goods that had not existed in Germany for years. I read about American soldiers receiving care packages from home filled with cigarettes, candy, and luxury items. We had been told Germany was winning the war of production. Every page of these newspapers proved that was a lie. The hamburger became a symbol of this ideological collapse. Unlike complex political arguments, a hamburger was undeniable physical evidence. Oberleutnant Hans Dietrich, interviewed by military intelligence at Camp Como, Mississippi, in June 1945, articulated what many prisoners felt: you cannot argue with a hamburger. You cannot claim it as propaganda. You cannot dismiss it as enemy lies. It exists. You taste it. And in that moment, you must confront the possibility that everything else you were told was also a lie. The Coca-Cola represented something even more psychologically devastating. It was the embodiment of American consumer culture that Nazi propaganda had ridiculed as frivolous and decadent. Yet here it was, mass-produced in quantities that seemed inexhaustible, delivered ice-cold to prisoner camps in the middle of nowhere, distributed freely to enemy soldiers. The implications were inescapable. Feldwebel Kurt Brenner, captured at Aachen and held at Camp Mexia, Texas, described the realization in stark terms during his 1946 Red Cross interview. When I held that cold Coca-Cola bottle, I understood that we had lost the war before it began. A nation that could produce such luxury items in the middle of total war, and could afford to give them to prisoners, possessed resources we could never match. The hamburger filled my stomach. The Coca-Cola broke my faith in everything I had believed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The psychological transformation of German POWs manifested most clearly in the letters they sent home, documents that revealed the complete inversion of their worldview. The U.S. Army, following Geneva Convention protocols, allowed prisoners to send censored mail to family members in Germany. These letters, monitored by military intelligence and preserved in National Archives records, provide extraordinary insight into the mental collapse occurring in American camps. Censorship officers at Camp Forest, Tennessee, noted an unusual pattern beginning in late 1943. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Morrison, chief censorship officer, filed a report on November 12, 1943. Prisoner correspondence initially contained expected content, reassurances of health, requests for news from home, expressions of hope for German victory. However, beginning approximately 6 weeks after arrival, letter content shifts dramatically. Prisoners begin describing their treatment in detail, specifically focusing on food quality and quantity. Many letters contain passages that sound like advertisements for American abundance. Gefreiter Ludwig Hoffmann's letter to his wife in Dusseldorf, written from Camp Alva, Oklahoma, on January 15, 1944, exemplifies this pattern. The letter, declassified in 1975, reads in part, Mein liebste Anna, you will not believe what I must tell you. Today for lunch we had fried chicken, more meat on one plate than we saw in a month at home. There were potatoes with real butter, not margarine. There was white bread, Anna, white bread like we had before the war. And they gave us Coca-Cola, ice cold, as much as we wanted. I am a prisoner of the enemy, yet I eat better than I did as a free man in Germany. What does this mean? What have we been fighting for? Intelligence analysts noticed that such letters created problems for German censors. Oberfeldwebel Werner Schultz, captured near Cherbourg and held at Camp Chaffee, Arkansas, later testified that letters from America were being suppressed by German authorities. My wife wrote that she received my first 3 letters, then nothing for months. After the war, I learned that the German Postal Service had been ordered to confiscate letters from American camps that contained descriptions of prisoner treatment. The truth was too dangerous to allow into Germany. The letters revealed another phenomenon that troubled both American and German authorities. Prisoners were pleading with family members to survive until American occupation. Unteroffizier Heinrich Vogel's letter to his parents in Bremen, dated March 3, 1945, from Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, stated, "Do whatever you must to survive until the Americans arrive." I know this sounds like treason, but I have seen the truth here. The Americans are not monsters. They will feed you. They will not harm you. Everything we were told was lies. Please, survive until they come. Such sentiments represented complete ideological capitulation. These were German soldiers, many of whom had fought fiercely for years, now actively hoping for American victory because they had experienced American treatment firsthand. The Hamburger and Coca-Cola had accomplished what Allied propaganda never could. They had convinced German soldiers that surrender to America was not defeat but salvation. Camp commanders recognized the strategic value of these letters. Brigadier General Howard Clark, commanding the POW camp system in the 8th Service Command, wrote to the War Department on April 7, 1945, "Prisoner correspondence has become our most effective psychological warfare tool. These men are telling their families the truth about American society and treatment of prisoners. This truth is more devastating to German morale than any bomb we could drop." The irony was not lost on German high command. Captured Gestapo documents from April 1945 show increasing concern about defeatist correspondence from American captivity. One memo, signed by SS Obergruppenführer Ernst Kaltenbrunner, ordered immediate family members of POWs in American camps to be monitored for susceptibility to enemy influence through corrupted correspondence. The devastating psychological impact of American POW treatment deepened when prisoners learned what was simultaneously happening to their families in Germany. This comparison between their own abundance and their families' suffering created a unique form of psychological torture, not through deprivation, but through the guilt of comfort. By early 1945, American intelligence had developed sophisticated methods of presenting information to German POWs. Captain Thomas Waverly, psychological warfare officer at Camp McCain, Mississippi, described the program in his after-action report dated February 20, 1945. "We began showing prisoners newsreel footage of conditions in Germany, the bombing damage, the food shortages, the civilian suffering. Then we took them to the mess hall and served them hamburgers and Coca-Cola." The contrast was intentional and devastating. Hauptmann Friedrich Lehmann, a battalion commander captured in the Hürtgen Forest, experienced this program at Camp Shelby. In his 1947 testimony to the Historical Division of the U.S. Army, he described the breaking point. "They showed us films of Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden. I saw buildings I recognized, reduced to rubble. Then a guard handed me a tray with a thick hamburger, fried potatoes, vegetables, pie, and a Coca-Cola. I looked at the food, looked at the screen still showing the ruins of my country, and I could not eat. I sat there for an hour, staring at the hamburger, thinking about my wife and children hiding in a basement, eating whatever scraps they could find. I was safe, warm, and well-fed while my family starved. The Americans did not need to torture me. The hamburger was torture enough." Red Cross reports from visits to American camps in spring 1945 documented what they termed prosperity guilt syndrome. Dr. Hans Weber, a Swiss Red Cross physician who inspected 15 camps between March and May 1945, noted in his official report, prisoners are experiencing severe psychological distress not from maltreatment but from the disparity between their conditions and those of their families. Many refuse to eat, not from lack of appetite but from guilt. American medical officers report increasing cases of what they term hamburger depression, prisoners who become catatonic when presented with food because it reminds them of what their families lack. The Coca-Cola became particularly symbolic of this disconnect. Oberstfreiter Anton Fischer, held at Camp Clark, Missouri, explained to interrogators in April 1945, "In Germany, my children have not had sugar in 2 years. They have forgotten what candy tastes like. Here, I drink Coca-Cola, liquid sugar, and I think about my daughter's face when she used to taste something sweet. The Americans give us ice cream while my children eat boiled nettles. How can I accept this? How can I swallow this Coca-Cola knowing what it means?" Military psychiatrists observe that this guilt transformed into political awakening. Major David Reynolds, chief psychiatrist at Camp Breckinridge, Kentucky, documented in his May 1945 report, "Prisoners are beginning to express anger not at America for treating them well, but at Germany for creating the situation where their families suffer while they feast." One prisoner stated, "Hitler promised us victory and prosperity. Instead, I have prosperity as a prisoner while my family faces defeat and starvation." Who is the real enemy? The comparative reality extended beyond food. Camp workshops provided prisoners with work opportunities, and many earned small wages. Feldwebel George Richter, working in the carpentry shop at Camp Huntsville, Texas, described his realization in a 1946 interview, "I was earning money, American money, working with good tools in a heated workshop. Meanwhile, my brother was in a Soviet camp, probably dead. My father was forced to work in a bombed-out factory for no pay. I was the prisoner, but I was the only free man in my family. This understanding broke something inside me." The true devastation to German morale came not just from the food itself, but from the understanding of what that food represented. The hamburger was not merely a meal, it was evidence of an industrial capacity that Germany could never match, even at the height of its power. Technical Sergeant Harold Patterson, supply officer at Camp Concordia, Kansas, maintained detailed logistics records that revealed the scale of American operations. His report dated June 1945 documented the supply chain supporting just one medium-sized camp, daily beef consumption, 2,400 pounds. Weekly Coca-Cola delivery, 15,000 bottles. Monthly sugar allocation, 8,000 pounds. Bread production, 1,200 loaves daily. All supplies delivered with absolute reliability, regardless of weather or military operations elsewhere. German officers, trained to understand military logistics, recognized immediately what these numbers meant. Oberst Klaus Reinhardt, a regimental commander captured in the Ruhr Pocket, analyzed the implications in his debriefing at Camp Butner, North Carolina, on May 15, 1945. "I calculated the resources required to feed prisoners at the level we were receiving. Then I multiplied that by the number of camps across America. Then I considered that American civilians were eating even better, and American soldiers in combat were also well supplied. The industrial capacity required to sustain this system exceeded Germany's total industrial output at our peak production. We were not defeated by better soldiers or superior tactics. We were buried under an avalanche of industrial capacity we could not comprehend." The Coca-Cola supply chain particularly fascinated German officers with logistical training. Major Ernst Keller, a quartermaster officer held at Camp Maxey, Texas, requested permission to study the camp's supply system. His report, written in English and preserved in camp records, analyzed what he observed. The Coca-Cola arrives in refrigerated trucks from bottling plants hundreds of miles away. The trucks run on gasoline that America produces in such abundance that they use it for civilian deliveries during wartime. The bottles are manufactured in dedicated factories, transported across vast distances, and distributed to remote camps without apparent strain on the system. In Germany, we could not maintain glass bottle production for military medical supplies. America produces glass bottles for a luxury beverage and delivers them to prisoners in the middle of Kansas. Prisoners who worked in camp kitchens gained even deeper insights. Gefreiter Paul Schneider, assigned to kitchen duty at Camp Como, Mississippi, wrote in his diary, later donated to the National World War II Museum, "Today I watched them prepare lunch for 2,000 prisoners. The amount of meat that arrived on one truck exceeded what my entire village in Bavaria would see in a month. The waste disposal contained more edible food than my family had eaten in a week. And this was just one camp, on one day, in one location. How many camps are there? How much food is being produced?" We were told Germany was the industrial powerhouse of Europe. But what I see here is not industrial power, it is something beyond anything we ever achieved. The hamburger thus became a unit of measurement for industrial capacity. Intelligence reports noted prisoners discussing hamburger economics, calculating German industrial capability in terms of how many hamburgers Germany could have produced. The answer was always devastating. Even at peak production in 1940, Germany could not have matched the casual abundance of one American POW camp. General Major Werner Hoffman, the highest-ranking officer at Camp Clinton, Mississippi, synthesized this realization in his final report before repatriation in 1946. "The hamburger defeated us more completely than any tank or bomber." It was proof that American propaganda was not exaggeration but understatement. A nation that could afford to feed its enemies better than we fed our own soldiers possessed resources beyond our capacity to resist. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The psychological breakdown of German POWs through American hospitality created a phenomenon that military observers termed ideological conversion through contrast. By mid-1945, camps across America were reporting that prisoners were voluntarily requesting re-education programs, not because they were forced, but because the cognitive dissonance had become unbearable. Colonel Vincent Hargrove, commanding officer of Camp Rupert, Idaho, documented this shift in his July 1945 report to the Provost Marshal General. "We established a voluntary discussion group where prisoners could ask questions about American society and democracy. We expected perhaps 20 participants. Over 800 men requested to attend. They wanted to understand how a democracy could outproduce a dictatorship. They wanted to know how a decadent society could demonstrate such strength. The hamburger had raised questions they could no longer ignore." Lieutenant Walter Krauss, a dedicated Nazi Party member captured at the Bulge, described his transformation in a 1947 interview with Army historians. "I had believed completely in National Socialism. I thought democracy was weak, that only authoritarian discipline could create true industrial power. Then I was captured and taken to Camp Cook, California. Every day, 3 meals. Every meal, more food than I could eat. Coca-Cola whenever we wanted. I asked the guards, how can you afford this? How can a democracy, with all its freedoms and inefficiencies, produce such abundance? They told me to read the camp library books about American industry. I spent 3 months reading. Everything I had believed was backwards." The transformation extended beyond political ideology to fundamental worldview changes. Feldwebel Gustav Richter, held at Camp Swift, Texas, worked in the camp's education program teaching English to fellow prisoners. His diary entry from August 12, 1945, reveals the depth of change. "Today in class, we discussed American values. One prisoner asked, if America is so powerful and we are defeated, why do they feed us so well? Why not starve us?" I realized I had been asking the same question for months. The answer terrified me, because they can afford to. They can afford to be merciful. They can afford to follow the Geneva Convention not because they must, but because the cost means nothing to them. A hamburger for every prisoner is a rounding error in their production capacity. This is not the weakness we were taught to expect. This is strength beyond our comprehension. Medical records from the Veterans Administration, compiled decades later, showed that former German POWs held in American camps had significantly different post-war outcomes than those held elsewhere. Dr. Friedrich Weber, a German psychiatrist who studied former POWs in the 1960s, noted, men who were held in American camps showed lower rates of post-traumatic stress, lower rates of violent behavior, and significantly higher rates of pro-democratic political views. The food was not just nutrition, it was re-education through experience. You cannot eat American abundance for 2 years and return home believing in American weakness. The Coca-Cola became a symbol of this transformation. Oberstfreiter Rudolf Koch, repatriated to Germany in 1946, described his return in a letter to his former camp commander at Camp Bowie, Texas. "I arrived in Bremen to find my city destroyed, my family living in ruins, no food except what the Americans provided through relief programs. The first thing the American relief workers gave us was Coca-Cola. I started crying. My wife asked why. I told her I had spent 2 years drinking Coca-Cola as a prisoner while she starved. Now Germany was defeated, and the Americans were still giving us Coca-Cola. She asked what I had learned in America. I told her, we fought the wrong war against the wrong enemy." Camp reunions began occurring as early as 1947, with former prisoners writing to their former captors expressing gratitude. The National Archives contains hundreds of such letters. One, from Hauptmann Ernst Weber to the commander of Camp McCain, Mississippi, dated March 1948, states, "The hamburgers and Coca-Cola you gave us accomplished what all the Allied propaganda could not. You showed us that our ideology was built on lies. You defeated us not with cruelty but with kindness. This was the most devastating defeat of all." The long-term impact of American POW treatment extended far beyond the war years, fundamentally shaping post-war German society and the relationship between former enemies. The hamburger and Coca-Cola had planted seeds of transformation that would influence German Reconstruction and the Cold War alliance between America and West Germany. General Lucius Clay, military governor of the American zone in occupied Germany, recognized this connection in his memoir published in 1950. "The German prisoners who returned from American camps became our most effective advocates for democracy. They had experienced American values firsthand. When we needed Germans to help rebuild their country along democratic lines, we found our strongest supporters among former POWs. They had tasted American abundance and wanted to build a Germany that could achieve similar prosperity through democratic means." Statistical analysis conducted by the U.S. State Department in 1952 revealed striking patterns. Of the approximately 380,000 German POWs held in the United States, over 45,000 requested permission to immigrate to America after the war. Another 23,000 maintained regular correspondence with their former camps. According to West German electoral studies from the 1950s, former POWs from American camps voted for pro-Western Democratic parties at rates 30% higher than the general population. Oberst Heinrich Brandt, who spent 3 years at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, became a prominent advocate for German-American friendship after the war. In a 1955 speech to the Bundestag, he stated, "I entered American captivity as an enemy. I left as someone who understood what Germany could become. The Americans did not break us through torture or deprivation. They broke us through generosity. Every hamburger was a lesson in democratic values. Every Coca-Cola was proof that free societies could outproduce authoritarian regimes. These lessons shaped the federal republic we are building today." The cultural impact proved equally significant. American food culture, introduced to German POWs in camps, became central to post-war German-American relations. The first McDonald's restaurant in Germany, opened in Munich in 1971, was championed by former POWs who had first tasted hamburgers in American camps. Coca-Cola's dominant position in German markets was facilitated by former POWs who associated the drink with American generosity rather than enemy propaganda. Dr. Helmut Schmidt, who became West German Chancellor in 1974, had interviewed hundreds of former POWs for his doctoral dissertation in 1949. His research, preserved in Hamburg University archives, concluded, the American POW camp system accomplished an unprecedented feat. It converted enemies into allies through the simple provision of adequate food and humane treatment. The psychological impact of this contrast between Nazi promises and American reality created a generation of Germans predisposed to Western alliance and democratic values. This may prove to be one of America's most successful foreign policy initiatives, though it was never planned as such. The reunions between former prisoners and guards became annual events at many former camp sites. Camp Concordia, Kansas, established a museum in 1980 featuring testimonies from both American guards and German prisoners. The dedication ceremony brought together men who had been enemies. Former Feldwebel Otto Zimmermann, speaking at the event, said, "I came to this camp in 1944 expecting death. Instead, I was given hamburgers and Coca-Cola. I learned that my enemies were more humane than my own government. This camp did not just hold prisoners, it freed us from the lies we had believed." Intelligence assessments from the early Cold War reveal that Soviet authorities understood the strategic impact of American POW treatment. A KGB report from 1948, declassified in 1992, noted with concern, German POWs returned from American camps represent a serious ideological challenge. They speak positively of democratic capitalism based on direct experience. Their testimony contradicts our narrative about American imperialism. Recommend restricting public statements by these individuals. The hamburger and Coca-Cola had thus become instruments of Cold War influence, proving more effective than propaganda in winning German allegiance to the Western Alliance. Former prisoners became living testimonials to American values, their transformed worldviews shaped by meals they could never forget. The story of German POWs broken by hamburgers and Coca-Cola reached its ultimate testimony in the final years of the 20th century, as the last survivors reflected on experiences that had transformed their lives and their nation. Their words, preserved in archives and documentaries, reveal the enduring psychological impact of American hospitality during wartime. In 1995, the 50th anniversary of VE Day brought together the largest reunion of former German POWs from American camps. Held at Camp Concordia, Kansas, the event attracted 312 former prisoners and 89 former American guards. The speeches delivered that day, recorded by the Library of Congress, captured the lasting significance of their shared experience. Gustav Schneider, age 76, who had been captured at Normandy and held at Camp Mexia, Texas, spoke with tears in his eyes, "I am here today because an American sergeant gave me a hamburger on June 18, 1944. I had been taught that Americans would torture me. Instead, they fed me better than I had eaten in years. That hamburger changed my life. It made me question everything. It made me understand that we had been lied to. I returned to Germany and spent 40 years building a democratic nation because I had tasted what democracy could provide. That hamburger was the most important meal of my life." Medical research conducted in the 1990s by the Max Planck Institute examined the long-term psychological effects of POW experiences. Dr. Wolfgang Benz, leading the study, found remarkable data. German POWs held in American camps showed significantly lower rates of post-traumatic stress disorder compared to those held in Soviet camps or even compared to German soldiers who were never captured. The American camp experience, particularly the adequate food and humane treatment, created positive memories that helped process war trauma. Many subjects specifically mention the first American meal as a transformative moment that helped them psychologically survive not just captivity but the entire post-war period. The last documented testimony came from Johannes Müller, who died in 2003 at age 89. In his final interview, recorded by the German Historical Institute, he reflected on his time at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. "I have lived 89 years. I fought in a terrible war. I saw my country destroyed and rebuilt. But the moment I remember most clearly was sitting in that Mississippi camp, holding a Coca-Cola bottle, feeling the ice-cold glass against my palm. I had believed America was our enemy. That Coca-Cola taught me the truth, we had been our own worst enemy. Germany lost the war, but Germans like me won a future because America chose kindness over revenge." The hamburger and Coca-Cola defeated the Third Reich more completely than all the armies that invaded Germany. The final statistical accounting, compiled by the Department of Defense in 2005, revealed the full scope of the program. Between 1943 and 1946, American POW camps served an estimated 275 million meals to German prisoners. The cost, approximately $180 million in 1940s dollars, represented less than the cost of a single day of combat operations in Europe. Yet the strategic return proved incalculable. Those meals helped transform Germany from enemy to ally, creating personal bonds and political transformations that shaped the entire post-war order. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans features an exhibit titled The Power of the Hamburger, displaying artifacts from POW camps, including original Coca-Cola bottles, mess hall equipment, and letters from prisoners to their families describing American food. The exhibit's closing text reads, "In 1944, the United States made a strategic decision: treat enemy prisoners according to the Geneva Convention, provide adequate food in humane conditions." This decision, embodied in simple meals of hamburgers and Coca-Cola, accomplished what weapons alone could not. It transformed enemies into friends, planted seeds of democracy in hostile soil, and demonstrated that American values were not propaganda but reality. The psychological victory achieved in POW camp mess halls proved as decisive as any battle won on the battlefield. Today, when elderly Germans speak of the war, many still mention the stories their fathers or grandfathers told about American camps, about the abundance, the kindness, and the hamburgers that changed everything. The weapon that broke them was not cruelty but compassion, not deprivation but plenty. In the end, America defeated Nazi ideology not through force alone, but through the simple act of sharing a meal. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.